Bobby Fazio.
Hello and welcome everybody. This is Driver Interviews with Bobby Fazio. Today is Tuesday, December 6th, 2022. End of the year is here. I think racing is just finished for the year. So, man, I'm already missing that Pomona weather. What a fun race that was. And I got a lot of interviews that are still coming. They're still in the pipeline. So stay tuned. I also just made for YouTube the somebody reminded me I never put it on YouTube. It was the Darcy Clark John Shaw heads up run, round one from Pomona. So I cut that up, and I'll be posting that maybe Thursday, because I don't know if I have enough time to finish another driver interview by Thursday because I'm heading to PRI. So anybody that is going to PRI, make sure you hit me up. All right, driverinterviews.com is the website. You know the deal. Go on the website. The big red YouTube logo will hit you in the face. Come on, I say this every week. Click on it. Click subscribe. That helps me out. We just hit 2,000 subscribers. So I'm pretty happy about that. Started the page when? Late March, I think. So 2,000 YouTube subscribers. Thank you all for watching. Thank you all for subscribing. Hit the like button. You know the deal. Shirts, stickers. I got them on driverinterviews.com. You can order them right there and put your address in. And shipping is pretty cheap. I'm talking about, I don't know, $25, $27, somewhere in that zone after shipping. And you get a free sticker with every shirt purchase. If you just want some stickers, they are $4.99, free shipping on the stickers. So check it out. If you want to sponsor, there's a sponsorship proposal on there. And click that. Click it, PDF, download, take a look. All right. Packages are starting about $80 a month. So you will get Tuesday tell-all episodes. You get driver interviews. Your name's going to get out there at least 8 times a month. All right, guys. Instagram and Facebook at Driver Interviews. All right. So we hit 2,600 followers on Facebook. We're at 700 and something Instagram followers. So I've been paying a little more attention to that. Trying to post more on Facebook and Instagram. YouTube was my #1 priority. So I'm trying to space it all out. But you can't miss anything. I do things on Instagram that aren't on Facebook, and things that are on Facebook that aren't on Instagram, and things that are on YouTube that aren't on either one of those. So get on all three, all right? At Driver Interviews gets you to all 3 of them. Drag Insights. Go to draginsights.com. Check out your stats. Check out your opponent's stats. Get contingency payments. You sign up for a premium membership. You get your 2 decals. Make sure you sign up for contingency. Get your 2 decals. And win a race or runner-up. Get a year extension, get 6 months extension. So lots of new cool things in there we've been working on. Just trying to interpret data in different ways, trying to get rid of certain outliers that might corrupt some of the data. So check it out. It's really all the stripe margins, all the leaving first versus leaving second, average reaction time when doing both, win percentage when doing both, left lane versus right lane. There's a lot of stuff in there, so check it out. All right, draginsights.com and Rob Youngblood, advancedclutches.com for all you stick racers out there. I mean, I should say all you cool racers out there. All right, go to advancedclutches.com. Check him out. He's got that 8-inch, his signature special there with the 6 fingers. Beautiful, beautiful clutch. He's got the 9-inch. He's got the 10-inch. He's got something dual disc. He's got something for everybody. So check it out, advancedclutches.com. Very knowledgeable and helpful gentleman that Rob Youngblood is. All right, guys. So today, this episode, this is our second tech episode. Our first one was with Robin Lawrence of Holly. We talked about electronic fuel injection, which is one of my favorite topics in racing because I'm pretty damn good with the computer, a lot better than I am with opening up a carburetor. Nobody understands that black magic anyway. Do that? Come on. Let's go in the computer. Let's deliver a certain specific pulse width that we can all understand. Let's talk volumetric efficiency, airflow. Come on, that's all good stuff, right? Easier to understand, isn't it? Well, today we're going to talk about camshafts, okay? the lifeblood of the engine, the thing that controls the valve opening and closing and all that air pump stuff that we all talk about. All right. Camshaft, in my opinion, most important aspect of the motor. We got my cam designer on here today, Mr. Buddy Rawls. We'll be getting to him in a minute. I'm looking forward to learning something today, and I know all of you will learn something as well. Every time I talk to Buddy, I learn something. So we're all going to be experts on cams after today. Before we get to that, a couple announcements. We have a lot of new blood here running things in NHRA. We have three tech position, or not tech. What am I talking about? Division directors. All right. Division 1, where I live, we got Craig Curdy. He just joined. So he's the new director of Division 1. I think he comes from a promoting background, dirt track stuff. I heard he sells out events. I love it. I heard some people say, well, he's not a racer. I don't care. Okay. I want somebody that could hopefully start packing the house at our events. To me, that's more important right now than him being a racer. And I'm looking forward to meeting him. D1 racers, don't piss off Craig Curdy yet. Okay. Everybody be nice to this guy and let him learn the position. Mike Rice was promoted to senior director of competition. So then Matt D. Young is now the division director out in D7, so out on the West Coast. So congrats, Mike Rice, to your promotion, senior director of competition. Matt D. Young, D7 director. And then Nick Duty is the new director of D5. So got a lot of new things going on here. It just wouldn't be a podcast. It just wouldn't be a Tuesday tell-all if my wife wasn't calling me during the episode every week. That's how it's going to be a good episode. You know, you would think that she knows that I'm broadcasting right now. I mean, she's an admin on my Facebook page. She should have gotten an alert before all you guys got an alert. But such is life. Such is married life. PRI roll call. Let me know who's going. Comment. I will see you guys there. I'm getting there Thursday evening, hopefully in time for the for that happy. I hope they have that happy hour again at the stadium that they had last year. Let me know if you're going to be there. Hit me up. Send me a Facebook message. SRAC survey. I saw some surveys out there. We got emails. So make sure you respond. Make sure you vote. Make sure, I don't want to get into the topic. I don't like to bring it up on podcast, and they ask us not to. So I'm just saying contact your SRAC representative. This is for stock and super stock racers. And then vote on the topic that they're asking you to vote on. And if you haven't seen it, it's on classracer.com, so check it out. We also have a huge rule change in Superstock. GT Superstock, the tech officials at NHRA have dropped a bombshell. Going forward, engine and body platform combinations that fit base Superstock are no longer eligible. So, I'll read it again. Engine, body, platform combinations that fit base Superstock are not eligible. Comment, let me know what you think about that. Big rule change in Superstock. Donations. Forgot to thank, I think I thanked them last week, but they're going to get thanked again today. So Lester Rogers, thank you very much for your donation. It was a nice, generous donation, so he gets 2 thank yous. Gregory Scott, thank you for your generous donation. Really, really appreciate it, guys. It helps me keep going. It helps me get out to these races, get more content, helps me go, network and push our brand of class racing, stock and super stock. All right. I appreciate it. Jimmy Carter, thank you for your donation. Jimmy Carter has been a multi-time donator. Is that a word? Supporter of Driver Interviews with Bobby Fazio. So thank you very much, Jimmy Carter. I appreciate it. All right, let's get to it. We got Buddy Rawls here, hailing from the great state of Alabama, I believe, and he is going to educate us on camshaft. So I can't wait to meet him. Let's get him in here. Buddy, are you there, sir?
Yes, I'm right here in Huntsville, Alabama.
All right. Well, Buddy, thank you for joining us. Thank you for taking the time to educate us on camshafts, educate somebody like me on camshafts who really doesn't know a whole lot about them. I know a couple of the terms I can throw around and act like I know what I'm talking about. I can say things like ramp rates and center lines and lobe separations, and maybe we should install that one straight up. Do I know exactly what I'm talking about? Nah, but who's going to know that, right? So, Buddy, why don't you tell us how you got into this? Give us a little bit of background on yourself, and then you can get into it. You can talk about whatever you want. You're educating us.
Okay. I started out in the 80s, street racing and going to the drag strip occasionally. And as I was going through my mechanical engineering schooling, started getting into the questions of how much horsepower a car has, or how much horsepower it takes to get down a track to a particular ET and speed. And pretty much about all we had at that time was that Moroso power speed calculator. And I bet your dad still has one laying around. But really, it just raised more questions because motor A makes more horsepower than motor B. And the power speed calculator doesn't tell you how, why, when, or anything like that. So I tried using engineering to determine horsepower of an engine combination, but terms like heat loss and control volume and work only muddied the waters, because that's not engine talk to normal racers and and engine enthusiasts and builders. The terms we know are like RPM, cubic inch, flow, duration, et cetera, and heat loss. It's like, how much heat loss have you got? And it's like, I don't have a flipping clue, and so engineering, thermodynamics, and power and energy conversion weren't really getting it done for me. I had to go a little different route. So I migrated towards a more detailed look at engines, using descriptions that we are typically comfortable with. And I want to get into a little bit. First off, there is no magic or voodoo or secret society with an engine. It's all quantifiable math, engineering, and so on and so forth. And if somebody does say something X, well, this is a little different, this is a mystery. It's like, mathematically, it's not a mystery. You may not know how to address it mathematically. I don't know how to address it mathematically, but it is addressable. And so an internal combustion engine, it is a quantifiable engineering system. And hopefully you should be able to address it with things that we know of, horsepower, airflow, and terms like that, as opposed to thermo terms or power and energy conversion terms. So anyway, through the 90s, I worked on my calculations and toyed around with starting an engine modeling software, actually, to get into camshafts. And at the time, Alan Lockheed was going, Patrick Hell, who did like the engine junior and engine senior, was going, Richard Jones, which was controlled induction software, and that's Mike Jones' brother that does the Mike Jones cams. And I believe this was a little bit before the performance trends by a year or so, but I was looking into starting that, and just where I was with the family, starting new engineer career and stuff, it wasn't jumping off into the car side with software, was not where I was needed to go. So in the mid 90s, I continued racing and working on the calculations and such. But I did an experiment in the mid 90s that really threw me for a loop, but it really didn't. I purchased a set of fully documented ported heads with everything for them and everything. Put them on the car. It was a well established, well sorted out car. Put them on the car, and it immediately lost 2/10 in an 1/8 mile.
Wow.
And it's like, and these heads, the heads I was running was like a stock Windsor head that flowed around 180 CFM at 28 inches, and these were up around like 225 or 230. Very nice set of ported heads, professionally done. Car just died. And so I got to looking at that and really, talking to engine builders and stuff, and they don't want to talk to people. And it's like, well, yeah, you just didn't do this and do that. But the thing is, this is exactly that motor A, motor B relationship that I was talking about a while ago. And so what's happening is so there's more to just flow. Everybody goes, well, flow equals horsepower. Flow, if you got this much flow, then you've got this much horsepower. But that is completely incorrect. What it does is flow does not equate to horsepower. What flow equates to is the opportunity for horsepower. You've got to get it into the motor correctly, so on and so forth. And the horsepower and flow equation has more to it. So the relationship of velocities, cylinder pressures, RPMs are all critical Therefore, the valve events themselves are intrinsically vital to the engine's output. This is where the difference is between motor A and motor B, and it's just it's the actual criteria parameters within the motor. So as I got further on in the late 90s, I got pretty happy with my calculations. And shortly after that, as I started talking to more and more builders, I got to seeing some of the builders were really building high powered motors, but they always built the same motor. And if you talk to some of these guys, when they would build something different, a lot of times they didn't get the output that they were desiring. And a lot of that's because the absolute numbers or measurements of like camshafts, for example, don't necessarily transfer over to another motor, because there's different cross sections, there's different velocities, there's everything different. The absolute numbers are not the answer. So the instance centers, the lobe separations, specific durations, that's not really the answer. What it comes down to is trends and generalities, and correct generalities. That's where the numbers are. And from that point is where optimization can occur. It's for example, it's possible to use the same valve event calculations for like a Toyota 20R grocery getter, or even like a rock crawler, that it is for like a 300 cubic inch competition eliminator motor. The end results don't look anything the same, but through the RPM range desired, based on the cross sections and the flows and the availabilities and the displaced volumes, same exact math. But like I said, the end results won't look the same at all. But so then around 2000, I started my home business, and that's pretty much where we are. I've been going at it for 22 some odd years. Just people online, people by phone, and just working it that way. And I've got a lot of good friends on the camshafts, Ed Curtis, Chris Straub, a lot of those guys. Mike Jones I've talked to a couple times. Brookshire I talked to quite a bit early on. John Steely, just a lot of people I've talked with. So anyway, I'll get on with it now. And so Bobby, I guess I'll go ahead and start with some terms.
Yeah, let's go. What do we got?
So some typical terms like duration, lift, lobe separation, these are all terms that are just enshrined in motor conversations when it comes down to camshafts. But there's a little bit more going on. So Bob, if you want to put up the PV diagram. So what this is this is a pressure volume trace of the capturing of air in the motor. The lower part there, I showed the piston, and I got this off the internet. The lower part there is the piston position in the bore, and the upper part, the curve, that's the volume change and the pressure change due to movement of the motor. And so what happens is the pressure and volume diagram. This is a very thermodynamic engineering, power and energy conversion look at a 4-stroke motor. And in this, and it may be kind of small, but in this, you've got the intake stroke, you've got compression, and then you've got combustion, and then you've got exhaust. So pretty much the 4 strokes are suck, squeeze, bang, blow. And so this lays out in this. So as you look across the IVO, the intake valve opening, it starts opening just before the piston is at top dead center. And as the piston hits top dead center on the overlap and starts coming back down the bore, about that time, the exhaust valve starts closing. So everybody will notice right off the bat, that's the overlap. That's where that's going on. So as the piston starts moving back down the bore, the intake valve is open, so it's drawing in charge. It gets to the bottom of the bore, and because you have inertia with that charge, the piston starts going up before the intake valve closes. So now the piston is going back up the bore, so we're coming up into the compression stroke. We have ignition, and then we hit right around top dead center compression. And everybody knows they set timing in the motor, and you're setting timing before top dead center. So that's exactly what's shown in this chart. So then the explosion occurs, you get a peak pressure, and then as the piston starts going back down, you start coming back down, your pressure is dropping, and what happens next? The exhaust valve starts opening. Gets down, the piston gets down at the bottom dead center. The valve is already open, so it starts coming back up. So what it's doing is pushing the exhaust out, just like that. And then you come right back up, and you're back into overlap. Everybody knows, that's where the exhaust valve's closed and the intake's opening right there. And that's what's happening. Some things that are kind of cool in this is that duration isn't really shown in this. It's shown as openings and closings. So you can change an opening or you can change a closing, but it's not necessarily about just growing duration on the opening and closing side symmetrically. For example, if you open the intake earlier, but you let it close where it was, you've increased duration, but you've also brought your center line in a little earlier. And so that's that you're getting into design aspects of camshaft at that point. So duration, we'll get back into it. So duration is measured in crankshaft degrees, and it's the distance, the angular distance between the opening and the closing at a specified lift. We see duration at 50 thousandths, we see duration at seat, we see duration at 20 thousandths. We look at ramp rate numbers by looking at durations at 100 thousandths lift on the lobe or 200 thousandths lift on the lobe. So duration is a meaningless number unless it is taken at a particular lift. And that's what gives you your comparison point, because everybody talks 50 thousandths numbers. When most everybody talks cams, they talk 50 thousandths durations. Right. And that's a very specific thing. That is duration at a known lift. That's comparable.
Why do they choose at 50? Why they can't go lower?
I have seen lots of articles to that, and I don't really know if there's ever been addressed that. I think that is just a good number that they went with, that is low enough to where you're not necessarily seeing ramp the ramp coming off the base circle. You're getting up into the duration somewhat. I almost wonder if 100 thousandths duration wouldn't be a better comparison point, but 50 is what the industry's been using for years. I couldn't tell you exactly when that started, but I know in the mid 70s they were using 50 thousandths. Sometimes before that, everybody had their own sort of thing. Iskandarian was doing something different, Crane was doing something different, and everybody had you had this 300-degree cam, and it's like, well, it looks just like this 280-degree cam, and this is some of that. It's you have to get to a comparison point so you can really know what apples are.
Right. So 50 has just become an industry standard. We think across the board, everybody's using 50.
Yeah. No. And like for hydraulics, typically it's that 006 number, although some of the companies were using 004. But yeah, it enables a comparison point. That is a true apples to apples comparison. Like 50 thousandths duration on this one cam is not going to be the same as 70 on this other cam.
Right. I do like this chart here, though, with the blue dots indicating every time a valve event is happening. So the x-axis is vacuum, right?
No,
is that
volume.
What you're saying?
It's volume.
Volume, right? Because as the piston's coming down, it's drawing in the air as when the intake's open. The piston's coming down, drawing in the air. So volume is at its largest there. That's why we're going in the positive X direction.
Yep.
Then the piston's coming back up to compress. Yep. So the volume is getting compressed to a minimal amount. Then the explosion. I like the star where the ignition charges before top dead center, because we all set that, 30 to 40 degrees before top dead center in most of our drag cars. And that's when the pressure reaches its max. So it looks like TDC compression. You have the C on the left side, but it reaches its max well after the the pressure max is well after the ignition, is what
Yes.
the
The ignition
illustration
occurs,
showing us.
but you've got to burn, you've got to expand, and it takes a second. All this is happening in microseconds or milliseconds, but it has to. It once it goes on up, you get the pressure spike right after the spark, and then you got the piston starting to come back down. And also on the TDC, top dead center compression, that's where you're setting all your valves and everything. And if you look, the intake valve is already closed and the exhaust valve isn't open yet. So there's where you're on the base circle of the cam right there.
Right.
So that's, you can sort of look through this and sort of pick out, oh, so there's what's happening. You can sort of see it. But I wanted to address it from this standpoint because most all the cam stuff I've read, they don't start here. They start right off the bat with durations and lifts and so on and so forth. And I know you've read lots of stuff and everything. And so I wanted to start there with the engineering. Being an engineer, it only makes sense for me to start with engineering, but everybody will fuss at me for being an engineer, but that's fine. I don't care. So as we get going, so there's things on here, like for example, peak lift. If you look at this pressure volume trace, is peak lift really, really, really important? Or is it more the ramp rate of how fast the valve opens or slow it that it opens, or how fast it closes or how slow it closes? See, that's more it. So it's like, so if you have a very, very, very fast opening valve, you've got a very strong, really, really, really rambunctious ramp rate. So you've got to have lift associated with that, or you'll have the lobe truncated, and then you just have a hellacious lobe that's problematic, which is, guess what? Very similar to the stock eliminator stuff.
Right. That's what I thought it would always be more beneficial to have a faster opening lobe. And in stock eliminator, like you just said, it's got to be a fast opening lobe because we can only go so high on the lift, and we try to keep the valve open as long as we can. So when's it more beneficial to have a slower opening?
Well, if you have a very, very, very high flow, very, very, very high flow capability, very large cross section, you may not want to open the valve as fast as possible. You want to open it when the door is small. You want to open the door as fast as you can and get everything through there. But if the door is huge and you only have so much, I mean, the cylinder is only going to move so much air. So if you have a huge, big door, you've got to maintain the door sort of opening it up kind of slow. But if it's a small door, it's got to open fast. Let's see here. And also we're talking about, so truncating the lobe like a stock eliminator does. So everybody will go, well, a stock eliminator cam, it runs real good, but I guarantee you that stock eliminator cam, if you were to do the exact same lobe profile, but don't truncate it at the lift cutoff for the rule, but say it goes up to around 600 thousandths lift, what do you think it's going to do? It's going to run pretty much the same, and you're going to save valve train. But that's, you can't do that within the rules. But
so you're thinking if you open the valve up fast, like we already do in stock, but in my Mustang 5.0, the stock lift is like 445, I think is what they spec me at.
Yes.
So we're opening fast, getting it to 445 or damn close, and then shutting it at the last second. Right. So you're saying if I was allowed to go up to 600, I wouldn't want that valve to open as quick. I would.
No, you would still want. What I'm saying is you could run the same ramp rate, but just not truncate it at that lift that gives you the 440. Let's say going up to like 580. Let everything come through the up through the seat, through 50, through 100, 200. Let it go all the way up, and just let it be dynamically stable. Don't truncate it. Don't make the lobe go flat, because the stocker lobes look like they're square on the thing. Let it come on up like a regular lobe, and you would save valve train, and you would have no real penalty on flow or engine. Matter of fact, it would help things. But that was just an example on that. That was just an example showing that lift isn't. lift is not really described in the piston in the PV diagram. What's described is ramp rate and positioning, and that's really where everything comes from with duration and lift. And lift is more of a byproduct of the Lobe design, except like in your class in stock eliminator, where you've got to truncate the lobe and make the lobe square to meet the class. You see what I'm saying? To meet that. If you didn't have that stipulation, those cams would be on up 620, 630, and so on and so forth. You're not really getting more air into the motor, but you are helping the valve train, because you guys are beating the springs to death on a lot of those motors for sure.
Because of that aggressive.
Yeah. Well, not so much the aggressive, but the truncating the square lobe part.
So why is that worse for the valve spring? I mean, it's keeping the valve spring, I guess, kind of in a stable spot for a little longer, and then
you might say the lifter is actually bouncing over that square part of the lobe, but you could also have the actual lobe, follow that and do that.
Okay, so in all of this design that you do, and to me, it would make sense that the cam is like the last thing that I would call you to design for the motor, because you need to know a lot about the volumes, the cylinder head flow, I guess the carburetor or throttle body size. You need to know header size. There's a lot of things you would need to know, and then I guess you have to come up with a determination of how fast you want a valve to open, how the timing of these events. What helps you decide, when to open the valve and when to shut the valve, and how do you work your magic here, then, buddy?
Well, typically, what my calculations end up with openings and closings and ramp rates, and it's all in the way I've got it set up now in my program that has been for 20 plus years. Is it's all kind of like ragu. It's all in there, but you take all the flows, volumes, RPMs, and just work it down into it, and you'll end up with openings and closings, and their center lines. And then with the center lines, intake center line, exhaust center line, that'll give you those added together and divided by 2, give you your lobe separation angle. And right, so here we go on there. So you've got your intake center line, which comes off the center line of the cam up opposite of the base circle on up. That's the peak point of peak lift on the intake and then on the exhaust. And the angle between those, which is the average between those, is going to end up giving you your base circle. So if you have a 108 intake center line and you have a 108 exhaust center line, that lobe separation is a 108. That would be defined as being a straight up camshaft.
So, buddy, when you say 108 degrees intake center line, what is that 108 degrees representing? Is that from the beginning of the intake valve opening to where it reaches its peak? What's the 108? Where does that come into play?
The 108 is the center line of the lobe up to its peak point. So that's the point in crankshaft degrees that occurs. And that 108 would occur at the very, very, very top of the peak lift. But the way you do this in the motor is like degreeing it. You do it off the openings and closings at the lobe. So you would take like the opening at 50 thousandths, go all the way through over the peak lift and come back down to the closing at 50 thousandths. And then add those together plus the 180 and get your duration. And then divide that back by 2. And that gives you the calculated center line, which if the lobe was fully symmetrical would agree, but the lobes are rarely fully symmetrical. But where I was talking earlier is the motor itself doesn't really know where the peak lift of the lobe occurs. Are you following me? It knows when the valves open and when the valves close, and it knows restrictions. It doesn't know anything about the cam. Like it doesn't know that, here comes 108. That's it. It doesn't know that. It only knows it from the points of the valve opening and the valve closing and how fast it goes. So you can utilize the center line at peak lift to establish, to get the criteria of a camshaft for like comparison purposes. But for me, I like the openings and closings. And like when I do the camshafts and send the stuff out for people to degree it on their installations, I use the openings and closings. And most of the cam companies do. Comp does, Crane does. They give you those numbers of the degreeing numbers. And if you actually work that backwards and go to the center line, it may or may not agree with what that cam card shows. Even though, yeah, here we go. Even though you've got your 50 thousandths numbers exactly right, it may not end up like, for example, this camshaft is installed at let me find it.
At a
107
line. Okay.
So the way they want it checked is at the 50 thousandths, the intake should be 28 before, and it should close at 62 after bottom. And if you calculate that, that should get you pretty close to 107. But the actual center of that lobe may actually be like 107 and a half or 108 or 106, doing it that way. This is where when you actually see a cam doctor versus actually degreeing a cam in this way, you'll see some variances. But in this cam, to degree this cam, what you would do is you would go off the openings and closings at 50 thousandths. So the peak point of the lift, for the 107 intake center line isn't necessarily really critical. It's the openings and closings in this chart that give you that.
All right, so let's get into more. So let's get into some real world examples here, and we can use my car if you want. The 19. So we'll start with stock eliminator here. We already said 92 Mustang 5.0. The heads are pretty bad. Small intake runners. Small exhaust, even has that little nub in there for emissions. I forget what the name of that thing is, and a small header. I mean, I run a step header. What would you do for somebody with a car like mine to try and get it to? What do you want? Max velocity in that situation? You want that valve opening, to get as the air in there quickly, or we're not going to get a whole lot of air in there. Now, the throttle body is bigger than like my Super Stocker. I guess my Super Stocker's got a carburetor that's rated around 450 CFM. The 60 millimeter throttle body on my Stocker is probably about 600. So I got a little bit more right there. But this lift that we got with, which is the 445 lift maximum. So let us know what your strategies are here, and what you would do in this situation and how you design these cams now.
Well, what would happen is for a given RPM, desired RPM that you want to run, or we
and
can
in my car, so I leave the line. I leave the line about 3,000. The converter flashes to 5, and I go through the traps around 6,500. So
yeah.
So I'm living between 5 and 6,500 at this point.
Sure. And so that would be criteria for calculating. So what's going to happen is you, with the displaced volume and the lower flows, because your intake flows probably 160, 168 at the most, 28 inches. And with the intake manifold on it, it may even be down lower, like 140 or so. So what's going to happen is through the calculation process, and also through just the common sense process, your air flow through that motor is already hauling ass. It is, because the ports are so small. So you can go with opening that door to the cylinder just as fast as you want to go, because you're really not ever going to be able to get it as fast as it actually can take, because you're limited to the valve train itself and just to the shape of the lobe and what the lifter can do. So in this case, with the motor being very restricted, I mean, you're going to open it and close it pretty fast.
So the restriction here is actually increasing the velocity already, because the ports are so small and the valves are so small, everything is so restricted in that small block Ford. You're saying velocity is already there. That's not something that we have to try and doctor up then. So
with a small head, no, it's already there. You can. It's got to be timed correctly into the movement of the piston, and that's where it gets back into that PV diagram I showed. Everything goes back to the engineering part of that. But yeah, everything's so you can't just throw as much duration and ramp rate at it as you can. It's got to be positioned correctly. The openings have to be correctly. The closings have to be correctly. It all comes out through the RPM, through the displaced volume, through the flows. It's really the flow is really flow availability. Because like we talked about a while ago, flow doesn't equal horsepower. It's got to be working with the motor. So it's really flow availability. But where the numbers come from, I mean, that's just through all the math coming out and getting you the openings and closings and so on. Where it came from,
taking, like you said, the RPM into account, the size, the heads, the flow numbers, which I got from from my engine builder, from the flow bench. But header size, you've taken that into account. Stick shift versus automatic, you got to take that into account. What are some of the differences you would do on a stick cam versus an automatic cam?
To me, technically, the stick versus the automatic camshaft by design are not really different. However, by the changing of RPM, with the automatic with the 3 gears and the longer gear spread versus the 4-speed or 5 or 6-speed with a narrower RPM band, you work it in that way. So with the automatic, you're going to be looking for a broader power band anyway, just because you've got a broader RPM band driving down the track. Like in your case, you're going 5,500 to 6,500, so or 5,000 to 6,500. And what does it drop down to on the gear shift to a second, third? It's around 4.
Yeah, so I'll shift around 6, and it'll drop down to about like 55, 5,400.
Oh, with the torque converter, yeah. Okay.
Right.
So that feeds into it.
So now with the 3-speed, and with that car, with the automatic, I mean, you're in first for a very short amount of time. I feel like I'm in first slightly longer than I'm in first with the stick shift super stocker.
Right.
And with that car, I mean, I'm hitting second at the tree and just in both the cars, definitely in the super stocker, and then by a 60-foot cone in the stocker.
Mm-hmm.
So with the super stocker, though, being a stick car and having the 4 gears, I'm not allowed a 5-speed in the 65 Mustang super stocker because it didn't come with one. Have a pretty, steep first gear in there. Living in a much higher RPM range, though. Now I'm up in between the 7,000 to 8,800 area. So now we're dealing with a lot more, I guess, and still restrictive. Heads not quite as restrictive because you're allowed to do a little bit more in super stock now, and we're opening the valve up a lot more. And we don't have lift and duration. There's no rules to follow in that area. But the velocity is still there, I would assume, because there's still some restriction here, and there's definitely restriction with the carburetor, and I don't know if that affects the velocity also when it comes into the cam design.
Well, you've got a larger cross section with the ported heads on your superstock car, which for a given RPM is going to be slower flow because your cross section is bigger. But in your case, you're turning significantly more RPMs. So you're probably running that port as hard velocity wise as you are in the stocker, if not more so. So what'll happen is on the superstock cam, once again, you're looking at very, very, very steep ramp rates. But because of your springs, because of the ability of running a solid roller, there are some definite advantages that you don't have the limitations of when you're in the stock.
Right, and now that's something that we've, solid roller in super stock. In stock, I'm not. Do people still run flat tappet cams in stock eliminator? I'm not sure if you're allowed to change that or not. I don't have one of those in my car. Mine came
Yeah,
with a hydraulic roller.
I think the flat tappet motors are still running flat tappets. They may be running different style of lifters, but they're still like your I think the 65 Mustang Stalker that you guys that you take pictures with occasionally, it's
Oh
most
yeah,
likely,
Mark
yeah,
Smart,
it's
right?
most likely a flat tappet motor.
Yeah,
I'm sure it is.
right. So the actual those design. So now we're into the classifications of the cams here,
Mhm.
and easier to design or harder to design when that's a stipulation. The flat tappet cam versus the solid cam, and then solid roller versus the hydraulic roller, and I mean vice.
Those are all parameters that I have built in, and most all cam designers have those built in. Like they don't necessarily. It's part of the process. So when it kicks out your openings and closings, like in my case, it's already built in that it's going to be a flat tappet or roller or so on and so forth. Other people may design it and get the openings and closings and then adjust it once they determine what the lifter type is. But in my case, I don't.
Okay, and then let's say stalkers that aren't as restricted as mine, maybe a Camaro, like a Gen 3 Camaro or a 305 or a 350. I don't know what their lift is offhand, but I know that their heads flow better than mine.
Right.
Would they go with a slightly less aggressive ramp rate in that
Well,
situation?
most all the stalkers are going to pretty much take advantage of maximum ramp rate. And it's not so much the fact that it's a stalker. It's really based more in the fact that you have X amount of volume displaced in the cylinder, and the stock heads, regardless of the motor, are going to be a restriction to the displaced volume. And in the case of your 5.0, it's greatly restricted. In the case of some of the small block Chevrolets and some of the late small block Chevrolets, it's quite a bit less restrictive. I don't know if you could really say that it would be as much as like a square port big block Chevrolet or anything like that, or like a 4-barrel Cleveland. But we're some of these late model motors are very, very, very nice motors that have quite a bit of flow. LS is some, but the typical small block Chevrolet that you would see through the 70s or 60s, 70s, and early 80s that you're seeing in stock and super stock and GT, those are going to be fairly restrictive. Not as restrictive as your 302 5-liter heads, but similarly restrictive because, they're larger cubic inch as well. So, if you've got a little bit larger head, if you're comparing your Ford head to that small block Chevrolet head or to that small block Chrysler head, you're looking at it and it's like, oh, that's a bigger head. But also we're pulling more cubic inches through it. So that just bounces right back up into getting the velocity back up again.
Okay. So we're going to assume here that with stock, with the limitation on the lift, aggressive ramp rates are the norm here. We're trying to get that valve open as quickly as we can, get it to its truncated position, and then shut it. So, buddy, when in super stock here, where we don't have to follow the rules on max lift, you're allowed to go as high as you want with the valves, with the lobes, and when you get away from a car that's restrictive like mine, small ports, and you get into something with like bigger ports, we'll say Gen 3 Camaros, or even somebody who's running a big block, a 69 Camaro and like super stock, D automatic or something, a 396. Now that you don't have a lift limitation, is that a situation where you can open that valve a little bit slower because it doesn't, I guess, it doesn't need as much velocity, or is that a situation where it does need more velocity?
Well, what's happening is you've got a larger head, like in the case of the big port 396. You've got a larger head. And so in direct comparison to your small block Ford, you go, man, that's a lot bigger cross section, but you're pulling through 100 cubic inches more, and you're still driving that thing on up to some pretty decent RPMs. So what happens is on the surface, it looks like you have a slower flowing setup because you've got a larger head. But when you put it all into everything with the larger cubic inches and higher RPMs a little bit and stuff like that, you come back up into a situation where you still have a semi-restrictive motor. And typically at upper RPMs, even the largest heads can become restrictive. And by restrictive, I don't necessarily mean it's restrictive. I mean it more that the cylinders, that the displaced volume, the motor itself as a brain sees that as a restriction. Does that make sense? Yeah, because everything is restrictions on the motor. It's sucking through a restriction and it's pushing out through a restriction.
All right. So now in the case of designing the cam, then are there people who want more than what you think? Like, I would say I want 800 lift. I want 900 lift. Take me out to the heavens, and it's obviously it can be counterproductive, I'm sure. Do you have people that just want more than what your math tells you to give them? Do you have to kind of put them back in their place?
Well, no, typically
back to earth.
Yeah, I don't necessarily look at max lift as a criteria unless it is a criteria of design, like it is in the case of stock eliminators or some of the shootout classes. But I go with what I do is by calculating the openings and closings and the ramp rates, I go and match that to the lobes. And what will happen is typically the lobe family is going to dictate pretty close to what your lift is. So like in the case of the Superstock car, for example, you guys are running a camshaft with an intake duration at 50 thousandths in the mid 270 range. And I believe your 200 thousandths is in the 210. I can't remember exactly what it was. But what's going to happen is just by lobe design, the dynamics design of the lobe, like on the Spintron and machines like you've heard, stuff like that, is going to dictate what that lift is going to be just from the profile. So what will happen is with a very, very, very steep ramp rate, you're probably going to see a little bit more lift out of it just because the lobe, everything has to track good on the lobe. Like if you see a very, very, very steep ramp rate and all of a sudden it's a real low lift, you're getting into a situation where you're maybe like a stock eliminator cam or like a lift restrictive cam and everything. But that lobe would do fine opening it on up to higher lift. But it's just not in the rules.
Right. How do you want us to break these cams in?
On a flat tappet, I'm very, very, very specific on that. Everybody's having so much trouble with flat tappet camshaft break-ins right now. And it's all over the internet. People are having trouble with this. Shops are having trouble with this. And you've got to run lower spring loads. Typically, I want to break in a flat tappet, hydraulic or solid, at like 80 to 100 pounds on seat, and then around 200 open. Run it that low, almost like a stock spring, but of course with enough lift capability out of the spring to where it works. But and then run it for 20, 30 minutes at the typical 2,000, 2,500, cycle through the RPMs a little bit around 1,800 to like 2,600 and stuff like that. And then when you get it there, listen. If it's a solid cam, listen for that sound change if something's going away. But it shouldn't be running that low of springs. And then let it come back down, let it cool down, check everything, and then go ahead and start pulling the springs off and putting your real springs on. On a roller or a hydraulic roller or a solid roller, you just let it go and listen for that sound, because you can tell when something's not right. When you fire that new motor up and you hear that thing just buzzing away, you can tell when something's not going right. And I mean, even like your dad, I'm sure he's listening to that thing just all ears, just listening for anything, and he can tell. And you can too, and everybody else. But just listen for that. And if it's a solid roller or a hydraulic roller, you shouldn't really be having any trouble with it. But listen for the sound, because something could be going away. You got needle bearings in the rollers. Just something can be happening. You could have keepers pulling up through. I mean, everything is just be listening.
Right,
But the critical thing is on a flat tappet. That's the part you've got to really be on top of that.
As far as lift, now you can build lift into the cam lobes, or you can increase the lift by going with a different ratio. You can go from the 1.6 to the 1.7 rocker arm. You think it's better to build the lift into the rocker arm as opposed to in the cam? I mean, to me, that would it puts less of a load on the lifters don't have to travel as far. The push rod doesn't have to travel as far. It's all just on the rocker arm. Isn't that, to me, that sounds like it would be better.
What happens is when you vary the rocker ratio, the valve activity is changing. The duration is changing because you're changing when you go to a higher rocker ratio, you're actually getting more lift per degree into it. When you go to a lower ratio, you're getting less lift per degree into it. And that's not that the lobe itself is changing. That's what's happening on the valve side. And if you want to pull up that valve trace PDF now, we can talk about that a little bit if you want to head that way. So what this chart shows is the blue line would be the lifter directly on the lobe, for example. And at 100 thousandths lift, it may be 184 degrees duration. When you put a rocker arm on there with like 1.6 and measure it at 100 thousandths, say, valve lift, your duration has gone up. It may have gone from 184 at the lobe to now around 210 at the valve. You increase that 1.6 to 1.7, and because you've increased your lift per degree, that means for a given lift, your duration has now widened. So it may go from a 210 degree at the valve to 217 degree at the valve with a 1.7. The way I look at changes, though, and in design, I usually shoot for a specific ratio that the user has, the end user or the builder has. And I like to use differing ratios as tuning mechanisms, more so than design criteria, unless specifically they say, this is what I'm using. And in, like, for example, if the small block Ford is a 1.6 and the person that's needing the camshaft runs 1.8, then that has to be in the design. So for example, if that's going to give you a bigger duration camshaft, so you've got to count that in. So if you only want, like, for example, if you want 275 at 50 thousandths and 1.6 is what the design is, but the person is using 1.8, you may have to take that lobe a little bit smaller to prevent overshooting how much valve activity he really needs. Does that make sense?
Right. So you're saying that even though it shouldn't, the lobe has not changed, but just having that numerically higher rocker arm ratio is increasing the duration, not just the peak lift. It's increasing the duration by a little bit. So you have to take that into account, is what you're saying.
Yes, because you could technically still put too much camshaft into the motor. You can sort of see, like, for example, if the camshaft was designed for a 1.6 and you go put a 1.8 in there, I mean, you could possibly effectively grow, just throwing numbers out there, 15 degrees at the valve. I mean, so you've increased your duration 15 degrees, and granted, the motor may not want that, may not like that.
Right. Okay. That's interesting. But then this is a two-part slide, so let's get to this next one here.
Yeah, the next part is people talk about what's happening, and they say, like, for example, increasing rocker ratio just increases the max lift. And so I've kind of thrown in just kind of a funny joke there that the little green tip up there on top of that red trace would be what happened if you increase to a higher ratio. But that's not really at all what happens. The chart before that's what happens. So that was this chart is more just shown as rationale on why that doesn't happen, or if you decrease your ratio like the yellow line, it doesn't just all of a sudden cut off at that lift, at that peak lift.
All right, so the moral of the story here is you don't want to go to too high of a rocker ratio. I mean, for obvious clearance reasons and things like that, you could hit the piston if you don't have the right piston to valve clearance and things like that. But you can overcam the motor. And
yes,
overcamming the motor, what exactly happens when you overcam the motor? You're just trying to shove. There's just too much air trying to get into a small space here, what's caused reversion. I mean, well, the dumb question here is, why is overcamming the motor bad? What's happening?
Well, typically what's like in the case of a big-headed motor, overcamming the motor means you are starting to open. And if you look at that PV diagram, we don't have to go to it, but what happens is you're opening the valve too early. And like if you think back on that PV diagram, if you open the valve too early on the intake right there, you're actually kind of pushing out some of your charge at the same time as the exhaust valve stuff is still closing. So you can't, you've got to be within a bounds of what the motor can use. So if the cam becomes too big, what'll happen is if you work this from an engineering standpoint, you're pretty much losing cylinder pressure, or you're transferring the peak cylinder pressure on up in the RPM band or up into a narrower area. So what happens is a lot of times the motor may make the same horsepower, but it has less area under the curve. It's less effective horsepower, because you need a good power band. You need a good curve that has a lot of good fulfillment of the torque and horsepower within the RPM band that you want to run. And by going with too big a camshaft, you can shoot that, especially like, for example, if you want to ship the motor at 8,000 and the camshaft you've got is optimized and runs at 8,000, and let's go in there and let's put 2 steps up in the rocker. Let's go from 1.6 to 1.8 rocker ratio. Now you've got that much more duration at the valve, and you may be, even though the motor is has the ability of turning more RPMs, it may not be capturing the cylinder pressure like you want.
All right, and cylinder pressure. So
yes,
that's like our number one thing. We want maximum cylinder pressure.
Yep.
Am I understanding this correctly?
Yep.
All right, so the velocity, all this stuff is to just maximize cylinder pressure and get the biggest explosion we can get, right?
Yeah, over the time of the motor itself. Because there may be ways you can maximize cylinder pressure and lose other parts of the motor's power curve because of that. Yeah. So you could overcam the motor drastically, and you don't have good cylinder pressure, so the motor falls on its face, and you don't have good mid range. But you know what you can add to the motor. This is a class form, but a class racer's form. But you can think back to it. So how can you boost cylinder pressure? You stick nitrous in there, and guess what happens? You get it.
Cylinder pressure, right?
Yep. You get it.
All right.
If the motor wants to make peak horsepower at 7,000, but the gearing is going to put the car going through the traps at 8,200, for example, I'll go ahead and bump the camshaft up, because I don't necessarily want to over rev the motor. And by over revving the motor, I'm not talking about mechanical failures. I'm just talking about beyond the flow capability of the way it's set up.
All right, now I want to get to this interesting chart that you sent me, that you came up with. So let's get that up on the full screen here. The valve timing chart.
Okay.
So this is really cool. Go ahead and explain to everybody what you got going on here.
So based on the PV diagram, I devised a way of looking at this. I wanted people through the years have wanted to know about camshafts and changes in camshafts. And as a designer, you don't necessarily want to give away your math. So what you want to do is you want to be able to have something that's meaningful, but yet does not give any secrets or math or way, So what this chart is it's more or less like a degree wheel. And I don't know how far out you are by looking at this. I don't know how close people can see this, but
it'll be a full screen. So
okay. So basically, like for example, if you just look at the intake side, and if you like the way I've got it up there, for a decreasing port velocity, the intake opening needs to come back a little bit, needs to be a little bit earlier. And somebody might go, well, what is a decreasing port velocity? That might be putting a larger head on the motor right off the bat. So with a larger head on the motor, the intake opening may need to be a little bit further back or a little bit earlier. Same thing with increasing RPM. Increasing RPM is going to bring port velocity back up. So your intake opening comes back out. For example, if you increase RPM and you increase your port size, so the increased RPM is going to increase your port velocity, but your port velocity is slowed down because you went to a larger cross section. Could be your intake opening still stays the same. That's kind of funny, but you sort of see how that's coming. And so you can move on around on the intake closing. And it's pretty much just dictated by RPM because you want to capture the cylinder pressure. So if you're increasing your RPM, your intake is going to close a little bit later. There are lots. People talk about what's most important, and a lot of times in the books they'll say the intake closing is most important. But if you look at the PV diagram, I keep going back to the PV diagram, because if you look at the PV diagram of when things are occurring, they're all four critical. There's not really one that's more so than the other.
I wish I want to bring them both up together. I don't think I can though.
Yeah.
So there's the PV diagram, which we brought up a couple times, and now back to the valve timing chart.
Yeah, and the reason the intake closing is held with such esteem is because that's when the pressure starts, the cylinder pressure starts. But if you don't get the intake opening correctly, getting the charge coming through the motor into the cylinder, it doesn't matter when the intake, it doesn't matter if the intake closes right. If the intake opening is too late, you don't get the filling that you need, or you don't get the charge coming through that you need, the airflow coming through. If the opening is too early, you don't have the port velocity there, so you get a lot of dead flow that's not doing anything before the piston starts moving. And actually, you may be pushing exhaust back out through the freaking intake, and that'll be reversion there. So it all feeds down into it, and that's why I contend that all four timing events are very critical.
So these errors that you have here now, these are adjustments that are the result. The decreasing port velocity you said could be putting bigger heads on. Are you saying that you need to move the cam position, or that's technically already moving the cam position? What do these errors mean?
Those are. So if you read, so if you look at the chart and like decreasing port velocity, as your port velocity decreases, your intake opening needs to come back earlier and earlier.
Decreasing port velocity's got an arrow going to the left, and you would then want to retard the cam a little bit to cure that. Is that what you're saying?
But it's not so much just retarding the camshaft, because you're also, when you retard the camshaft or advance the camshaft, you're also jacking around with the exhaust lobe at the same time. Right. So it may be that the motor doesn't want the exhaust moved.
So is there anything in here that can be cured if you think? Now, I don't know how you would really know what's wrong at this point, but I guess you could do trial and error of retarding the cam a little bit or advancing the cam a little bit, maybe 1 or 2 degrees at a time, to try and mess with these, these figures.
You could do that experimentally. What if the camshaft is optimum, for example, then advancing or retarding should get you problems going either way. But if you advance the cam, for example, and you increase cylinder pressure a little bit or get some RPMs back out of the motor, a lot of people will say like advancing the camshaft helps the low end of the motor, and you've heard that, and retarding it helps the upper end. The only problem is if the camshaft's not right to begin with, It could be that advancing the camshaft helps everything, helps upper RPM and all. It could be that retarding the cam helps low end if that's what the motor is needing at that point. It's advancing retarding really comes in as a troubleshooting method or as a way of on each side of the optimization, because you just can't at will say that advancing helps low end and retarding helps upper end, and that's where a lot of people go with that.
Yeah, and we've tried all that, and to be honest, we've never really seen a difference when we have tried those things. So, we've tried. We've did the whole 1.6, 1.7, rocker arms. We never saw a difference with that either in our old super stock engine. We haven't tried it with any of the with our engine the last couple of years.
Most of the super stock stuff, like if you look at a super stock camshaft now versus a super stock once they started allowing ported heads, which I guess was early 80s, I guess, as long as they were running the solid roller, the cams haven't really changed that much. Cam technology has changed, but the durations and just the overall looks of the cams haven't really changed that much. The super stock forward combination, the 64.5 and 65 or 63 through 65 289, that is a very, very, very well established combination, just like all the small block Chevrolets for the different years and everything like that. And person A's camshaft versus person B's camshaft, lift may be different, duration may be a little hair different, but by and large, the trend and look of the camshaft is going to be quite there. So what you're seeing is, if you think about this as a bell curve, you're already sort of at the top of the bell curve. You may not be at the top, but you're near it. So unless you really, really, really are honked up on something, you're going to be still staying up near the top of that curve. So changes in rocker ratio and things like that, they're there. On a dyno, you may see them, but getting down the track, you may or may not feel them, and it may not help you get down the track. It may help you 60 foot, but it doesn't help you on up the upper end. You've got to get out of the very well-established combinations like you see in stock and super stock. You've got to be in just the guy that's building a new motor for a shootout car or a hot rod type thing like that, to see that. Because when you're making comparisons on the class cars, especially stock and super stock, the criteria, like if you look at an off-the-shelf camshaft for a super stock car, chances are probably 85 to 90% of the time, it's not that different than what you've got. It may be similar. It may have less lift. It may have more lift or whatever. But if you just look in general, it's like, that's pretty close to what we're running, and that's because the parameters are so well known on that. Now, things changed on the super stock stuff when they started allowing aluminum heads lately. It's they're getting factored at a higher horsepower or a higher weight. And those cams are looking different because they've now gone from, like in the case of the small block Fords that are flowing like 215 28 inches max, to now some heads that are flowing up around like 235 or 240. That's a big difference. And the camshaft will look different in those motors. I
don't use them for me because I'm rated at 209 as a 65 Mustang versus the aluminum heads rated at 225, I believe.
Right.
But I heard you can make a lot of power with them. So,
well, heck yeah.
I don't know if it's worth that 16 horsepower weight penalty. I just figured the small carb, I just don't see how you could do so much more with them. But, I know other combos where it is a big, and despite the big horsepower penalty, I know it works.
Right.
So maybe in the future, someday, who knows?
Go to a GT and run the Mercury setup with the 600.
Yeah, well, didn't want to call that one out.
And also, it's kind of funny is like a double overhead cam motor, it doesn't have a lobe separation. It's got an effective lobe separation, but think about it. I mean, it does, it's got an intake cam and exhaust cam. That's kind of funny.
I know. I feel like we would need to do a separate episode for that. I mean,
let's not. What's been happening since COVID? Because I'm a low volume cam guy. Some of the big shops maybe are not, are not really seeing a lot of differences. But it's hard to get stuff. And that was one of the things on doing a podcast like this, is drumming up business. And this was not necessarily intended to grow my business. This was just to get some things out there, because the camshafts right now, I've still been waiting on one since July 15th for a personal camshaft for my Cobra kit car. And there's nothing I can do about it. I call them up and it's like, they're just not here. And it's like, so I do not want to take on a camshaft for somebody and say, yes, I'll have it there in 3 weeks, because I have no flipping clue when this stuff's going to be coming in.
Oh man. I don't know. I'm hoping things will just be back to normal for all of us eventually,
Yes.
and supply chains and all that good stuff.
Right.
Maybe even some inflation might come back down. Who knows? I read that somewhere today that it might come down a little bit next year. Let's hope that was true.
Yeah.
I don't remember what source that was. It was probably some Facebook meme or something. Who knows? But anyways,
Right.
buddy, thanks for coming on, sharing all of this knowledge with us. And
well, thank you for having me.
Knows a little bit more about cams now. I know I do. Cylinder pressure. That's what we want. We want lots of it. We want as much of it as we can handle. Right, buddy?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So you take care. Thanks for joining us. Have a happy holiday if I don't see you.
Okay.
And I won't be seeing you at PRI though, will I?
No.
Okay.
We'll be doing some pretty good stuff at work, at my regular work on that, but or not car related, but space related. But yeah, I would like to go to PRI, but I won't be there.
All right. And anybody that has questions, feel free to comment, obviously, on this podcast here. And if Buddy has some time, maybe he can get around to some of your questions after he's done designing my cam. All right, guys. Thanks a lot. Take care. Have a good one. Merry Christmas.